Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less academic and a whole lot more herbal. We're taking a foggy, fragrant journey into the weird, surprising world of medieval intoxication. Yes, they did it. And yes, things got weird. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's drifting through this strange little corner of history with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's tempting to picture the Middle Ages as a joyless slog mud, monks, plagues, and potatoes. But under all that wool and despair were people, regular, flawed, experimental people. People who, every now and then, looked at a weird root and thought, I wonder what happens if I boil this in wine and drink it while staring into the fire. And honestly, who could blame them? There was no electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants. Local entertainment was limited. Maybe a monk reading very slowly, or your neighbor dancing until he collapsed from moldy bread poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that could help you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably eat it too. Contrary to what we often assume, using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or just soften the edge of a brutal day wasn't rare in the Middle Ages. In fact, it was baked into the culture, but it wasn't called getting high. You didn't have two peasants giggling behind a haystack with a lute and a joint. Instead, it was dressed up as visionary experience, divine inspiration, pain relief, or on rougher days, a terrible mistake on an empty stomach. Doctors used herbs. Monks grew them. Witches, depending on your local inquisitor, applied them. Almost everyone encountered these substances in some form, whether through medicine, rituals, or accidental moldy food. And it wasn't limited to warm ale, though that certainly helped. We're talking about roots that screamed, seeds that triggered prophetic dreams, and ointments that made people believe they were flying through the night sky with Satan's catering team. The point is, getting high in medieval Europe wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was spiritual, sometimes it was medicinal, and sometimes it was just what happened when you asked a barefoot guy named Wolf for help with a headache. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague sense of what was safe. Because back then, nature was the dealer, and she did not include warning labels. Let's start with henbane, or as I like to call it, let's push this button and see what happens. Henbane, or Hyoscyamus niger, was a staple in the unofficial medieval medicine cabinet. It was used across Europe for centuries, and had a reputation that ranged from miracle herb to a party ruiner. Monks recorded it, physicians dosed it, witches smeared it on their broomsticks. Peasants mostly hoped not to eat it by accident. So what did it actually do? In small amounts, it worked as a sedative. It could ease pain, calm nerves, and even help with childbirth. Kind of like the medieval version of melatonin with side effects. In large doses though, things got wild. We're talking hallucinations, delirium, dry mouth, and the sudden belief that your grandmother is trapped in a turnip. Henbane contains compounds like scopolamine and hyoscyamus, which interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain. To put it less scientifically, your medieval brain goes weird. Fast, visual distortions, extreme thirst, and random interpretive dancing were just part of the experience. Henbane was brewed into tea, smoked, or mixed with animal fat and smeared on the skin. Great if you didn't like your consciousness arranged in a straight line. Technically, it was legal. Controlled substances weren't really a thing, but it was controversial, especially in church circles. After all, visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, it found fans among mystics, or healers, and people with absolutely nothing to lose. At one point, it was even added to beer, until someone had the bright idea to switch it out for hops. But if henbane was unpredictable, mandrake was full-on mythological. Mandrake mandragora officinarum was a root that looked vaguely like a twisted little person. According to legend, it screamed when pulled from the ground, and that scream could kill you. So, naturally, people kept digging it up. How? Well, the most popular method involved tying the root to a dog and letting the poor animal do the dirty work while you hid behind a rock. Ethical? No. But very medieval, once harvested. Mandrake was dried, powdered, or turned into tea. In theory, it could knock you out before surgery, help with fertility, and induce prophetic dreams. In practice, it could also knock you unconscious, trigger vomiting, or make you think your soup was whispering secrets. It was used carefully sometimes by monks, sometimes by those we might now call alternative healers, and despite the church's suspicions, it never fully disappeared from herbal medicine. Next up, we have the glamorous but deadly belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. This plant was the medieval version of a beautiful X with a restraining order. Its name, belladonna, means beautiful woman, because it was used cosmetically to dilate pupils. Big eyes were seen as attractive, mysterious, and saintly. Downside, you couldn't see much, and occasionally, you died. Belladonna contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which mess with the nervous system. Low doses, sleepiness, pain relief, blurry vision. Higher doses, vivid hallucinations, confusion, and the possibility of becoming best friends with your own shadow. It was used in flying ointments, love potions, and even early surgical practices. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it terrify the clergy? Always. And speaking of flying ointments, let's talk about how people in the Middle Ages applied these substances not always by mouth. Enter the transdermal method, or in plain English, rubbing weird stuff on your skin and hoping for the best. These ointments, often a mix of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, pig fat, and other questionable ingredients, were sometimes applied to mucous membranes, including areas you really don't want to think about when there's a broomstick involved. Why? Because these spots absorbed quickly, and so the infamous connection between witches and flying broomsticks wasn't just symbolism, it was pharmacology, and a little bit of medieval awkwardness. Users would report flying through the night, attending feasts with demons, or just floating over the village like a confused bat. Hallucinations. Definitely, but in an age where the line between magic and medicine was blurry, those visions carried weight. Alright, that's where we'll pause for now. Let me know when you're ready for part 2, where we dive into mad honey, ergot hallucinations, incense highs, and how the Islamic world mastered cannabis centuries before Europe figured out which end of the pipe to light. So we've talked about henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, 3 plants that made medieval medicine feel like a gamble with a hallucinogenic dice roll. But those were just the warm-ups, because when it comes to accidental intoxication, few things hit harder or stranger than ergot. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the untrained eye, it looks like a slightly weird blackened kernel, but to modern science, it's basically the ancestor of LSD. Seriously? It contains lysergic acid, and when baked into bread, like a lot of medieval bread, it could trigger convulsions, hallucinations, and in extreme cases, full-blown village-wide delirium. There were 2 types of ergotism. One was convulsive, which meant seizures, spasms, crawling sensations under the skin, and vivid hallucinations, basically the worst sleep paralysis you've ever heard of, but shared with your neighbors. The other was gangrenous, which cut off blood flow to limbs, blackened the skin, and occasionally led to body parts just falling off. Historians believe ergot outbreaks were responsible for dancing plagues, those bizarre, semi-legendary events where groups of people would dance uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, hysteria, or punishment from God. In reality, it might have just been dinner gone deeply wrong. Ergot was especially common in colder, wetter regions like France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Rye bread was a staple for the poor, and with no knowledge of fungi or foodborne toxins, people just ate it anyway, because hunger trumped weirdness. That's the Middle Ages for you. Some scholars even think ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials, that the visions, seizures, and paranoia might have stemmed from contaminated food. It's debated, but it's a chilling thought. Entire societies altered by bad grain. Now, if you've ever wondered whether bees were in on the medieval drug trade, the answer is yes. Enter mad honey. This wasn't your average floral sweetener. In the mountainous regions around the Black Sea, especially in what's now Turkey, bees collected nectar from rhododendron flowers, which are naturally laced with granotoxins. The result was a sticky, reddish honey that could cause dizziness, nausea, slowed heart rate, hallucinations, and spiritual visions, sometimes in that exact order. A little bit of mad honey, mild euphoria. Too much, you might start naming furniture. But it wasn't just a curiosity, it was weaponized. According to both Greek and medieval sources, Local tribes would leave jars of mad honey behind as traps for invading armies. Soldiers would stumble on what they assumed was abandoned food, eat it, and be incapacitated within hours. Some would vomit, others would convulse, and more than a few would hallucinate their way right out of a military formation. Local populations, however, knew what they were dealing with. They used mad honey in small doses as medicine pain relief, anti-inflammatory, even mild sedative, and in certain mystic circles, it was considered a spiritual aid, a spoonful in wine, a smear on bread, a recipe for visions or a very bad nap. Unlike belladonna or mandrake, mad honey actually tasted good, which made it all the more dangerous. Let's shift to a different kind of high, the kind that came with incense and holy spaces. When you picture a medieval church, you probably imagine stained glass, chanting monks, and that thick, rolling incense smoke drifting through the air like divine fog. But that cloud wasn't just for show. It had psychoactive properties. The two stars of medieval incense were frankincense and myrrh, both resinous substances imported from Arabia and East Africa, burned in temples and churches. They were meant to cleanse the space, ward off evil, and make things smell less like goat and death. But there was a chemical side effect too. Modern studies have found that burning frankincense releases insensyl acetate, a compound that affects the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. Translation: sit in a thick cloud of incense long enough and you'll feel floaty, calm, or even a little spiritually lifted. Now imagine you're fasting, you're dehydrated. You've been chanting Latin for 4 hours in a dark chapel full of smoke. Visions weren't just common, they were practically encouraged. Monks wrote them down. Devotees described feeling close to God. And while divine inspiration is a beautiful thing, it's entirely possible some of those visions were just really good resin, combined with light oxygen deprivation. And it wasn't just in Christian churches. Incense was used across mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and pagan rituals. Everyone loved a good sacred scent. It wasn't just about holiness, it was about altering perception in a socially acceptable way. Think of it as the medieval version of lighting a candle, putting on lo-fi music, and pretending your soul's doing okay. Alright, now let's talk alcohol. Because while herbal highs and psychotropic salves had their moment, alcohol was the everyday buzz of medieval life. Beer, mead, wine, cider if it fermented. Someone was drinking it. And not just to get drunk. In a time when water was often unsafe because livestock upstream had no manners, low alcohol beverages were the safest thing to drink. Enter small beer, a weak ale brewed for daily consumption. It was hydrating, mildly alcoholic, and often safer than the well. Even kids drank it, not for a buzz, but for survival. Brewing wasn't just a pastime, it was public health. If you had money or stronger tolerance, you might move up to heavier ales, spiced wines, or honey meads. Wine, especially, was often mixed with herbs and spices, not for taste necessarily, but for medicinal effect or curiosity. In monasteries, brewing was a sacred duty. Monks didn't just drink, they perfected fermentation. Some abbeys became famous for their beer, and recipes were closely guarded. Brewing was considered both spiritual labor and practical medicine. Got a toothache? Warm ale, melancholy, spiced wine. Depressed about your thatched roof hovel, and the one-eyed chicken judging you from across the room. Pour another mead. Taverns, inns, and roadside alehouses weren't just places to drink, they were therapy clinics, social hubs, and gossip factories. Getting a little buzzed was often the only way to cope with the everyday slog of medieval life. And now we arrive at something truly wild edibles. Medieval style, before modern cannabis gummies and artisan THC chocolate bars, medieval people had ointments, teas, tinctures, and potions. Some were taken voluntarily, others not so much. Many were rubbed on the skin, mixed with fat, wine, honey, or resin. Some were brewed in cauldrons, others smeared on, mucous membranes. Yes, we're back to the broomsticks. Flying ointments, the stuff of witch trial legends, were thick with belladonna, pembane, mandrake, and animal fat. Applied topically, they could knock someone out, give them visions, or convince them they were a cloud. But not all edibles were spiritual or ritualistic. Some were practical. Apothecaries often made spiced wine laced with poppy extract, basically medieval NyQuil. It dulled pain. induced sleep, or made you believe your cat was speaking French. Results varied. And then there were the snake oil salesmen, wandering quacks, who sold elixirs claiming to cure everything from heartbreak to plague. The recipes, secret. The side effects, worrying. But if you were desperate, and most people were, it was worth the coin. The magic of these concoctions wasn't just in their ingredients, it was in the unpredictability. Would you sleep soundly, receive a divine vision, or end up arguing with a potato in a ditch? There was only one way to find out. That's where we'll leave it for now. In part 3, we'll explore the real MVPs of medieval psychedelia, the underground herbalists, wise women, village shamans, and midwives, those shadowy figures who knew every plant in the forest and every secret in your soul. We'll also answer the question, how did medieval people actually feel about all of this? Was it holy, heretical, or just Tuesday? Let me know when you're ready to continue. So far, we've wandered through smoky chapels, trippy teas, and fungus-laced loaves of accidental LSD. But here's the truth. The real masters of medieval intoxication weren't monks or monarchs. They were the herbalists, the cunning folk, the midwives, and the village witches, those shadowy, half-respected, half-feared figures who lived at the edge of the field and always seemed to know exactly what to give you when your dreams got loud. They weren't doctors in the formal sense, no Latin degrees, no university robes, but they had knowledge deep, inherited, often female knowledge about the plants that grew wild, the roots that cured fever, the mushrooms that made you speak in tongues. These were the people you went to when the town physician suggested leeches for a headache, or when you couldn't sleep because you were haunted by grief, or fever, or something darker. They worked in shadows and gardens. They used bark, ricin, crushed beetles, and fat from a black cat if you believed the folklore. They whispered prayers over your tea. They chewed bitter leaves so you didn't have to. They sent you home with a pouch of herbs that could either fix your soul or make you confess to crimes you'd never committed. Many were women midwives, healers, bone setters, and that made them both essential and dangerous, because power without official approval is always suspicious, especially when that power comes with salves, knowledge of childbirth, and a habit of not quoting the Bible before every diagnosis. If something went wrong, if you hallucinated too vividly, or started talking to the moon, blame shifted fast. What was once an herbal remedy became witchcraft. What was once folk medicine became heresy. The church watched them closely. Authorities grew nervous, because these people were living proof that you didn't need a priest to feel close to the divine, or a doctor to cure your sickness, or a man to explain your pain. Still, communities relied on them. When your child had a fever, when your joints ached, when you wanted to speak to a lost loved one in a dream, they were who you turned to. They weren't saints. They weren't villains. They were the original underground wellness influencers, and their legacy still ripples through modern herbalism, homeopathy, and holistic healing circles today. But that brings us to the big question, how did medieval people actually feel about getting high? And the answer is deeply, hilariously conflicted. Let's break it down. Wicked, the practical users, for healers, apothecaries, and midwives. Mind-altering substances were tools. If something dulled pain, soothed anxiety, or made childbirth slightly less horrifying, it was medicine, not magic. If the patient started mumbling in Latin or thought their bed was floating, side effect. As long as they weren't screaming and the swelling went down, success. 2. The spiritual seekers, for monks, mystics, and visionaries. Altered states weren't accidents. They were the goal. Hallucinations weren't symptoms. They were messages. If you stared at a candle for 6 hours and saw an angel whispering your true name, that wasn't a red flag. It was revelation. If you fasted for days, inhaled incense, and floated out of your body, that was progress. In fact, some saints were revered precisely because of their visions, ecstatic trances, divine dreams, encounters with celestial beings. The church called it sanctity, as long as it came from the right people. Which brings us to 3. The suspicious outsiders. If a nobleman had a vision, it was a miracle. If a peasant woman had one, it was probably Satan. Intent mattered. Status mattered. Gender definitely mattered. Getting high by accident. Fine. Getting high to speak to Jesus. Acceptable. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon in the forest. Now we have a problem. The church drew a line between holy visions and heretical madness. Even though the ingredients often came from the same garden, saints were allowed to see things. Peasants, not so much. Shut. The everyday folk. Among the regular population, opinions were more chill. Your neighbor's sleeping potion might double as a psychedelic nightcap. Your grandma's cough syrup might contain enough poppy extract to drop a mule. People weren't chasing highs, they were chasing relief. Henbane tea for anxiety, hashish for grief, a bit of mad honey to forget that you lived in a damp hovel with 11 relatives and one goat who stared too much. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't enlightenment, it was just Tuesday. Sich, the authorities. As always, power feared what it couldn't control. Substances that altered perception were dangerous, not because of what they did to the body, but because of what they suggested about the soul. If you could reach ecstasy without the church, if you could dream vividly without a priest, if you could feel joy while being poor, that was threatening. And so, the gray area grew. Getting high in the Middle Ages lived between miracle and misdemeanor, between cure and curse, between health and heresy. And that's kind of beautiful, because in a world ruled by plague, famine, and rigid hierarchy where your job was chosen for you, your faith dictated to you, and your suffering accepted as divine plan, sometimes all you had was a plant, a prayer, and a sliver of altered consciousness. And for a few brief, fragrant moments, maybe that was enough. If you've made it this far, thanks for wandering through the fog with me. If this strange, herbal corner of history brought you any peace, perspective, or curiosity, consider subscribing, but only if it actually brings you joy. And if you want to support this work further, share the video, leave a comment, and tell me which medieval intoxicant would you try if you had to pick one. Sleep well, dream weird. See you next time.